desolate. And he went out of the temple. And that brings us to chapter 24. So if you could turn to Matthew 24, I would recommend you try to keep the Bible open there today. I think you might want to try to follow a little bit at the verses that we'll be looking at in particular. So let's just read the first 3 verses to get us started. Matthew 24, verses 1 through 3. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So at the end of chapter 23, Jesus had basically pronounced judgment on the temple, and he's leaving, and the disciples said, "Look how great the temple is," right? And so Jesus says, "Yeah, it's coming down." And the disciples ask him, "When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" This question of the disciples prompts Jesus' final major discourse, right? We talked about there being considered to be 5 major discourses, 5 major speeches of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. This is the last one. And this discourse is sometimes called the Olivet Discourse because Jesus spoke it on the Mount of Olives. Sometimes it's called the Eschatological Discourse, big word, eschatological. Just means the last things. It's a study of the last things. And so eschatology just means a theology of the end. And this discourse is notoriously difficult and has many different interpretations. The major question of interest for most people when coming to this passage is, when is this about? And that was actually the disciples' question, right? They asked, "When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So maybe it's appropriate that we want to try to understand when these things will be. So can we determine the when from Jesus' answer? We can actually think of the disciples' question as a 2-part question, right? When is the first part, and what will be the sign is the second part. The question of when looks at first like it is a question of when the temple will be destroyed, because Jesus was talking about the destruction of the temple, and they said, "When will these things be?" In this case, their question would be 2 different questions if the question of the when is about the destruction of the temple, right? So when will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? These look like unrelated questions, 2 separate questions. And if they are 2 separate questions, it is quite strange that they would ask them together like this. Why would they suddenly ask about when is the destruction of the temple and then about his coming? The fact that they asked these questions together already suggests that they knew that the destruction of the temple and Jesus' second coming and the end of the age were somehow related. So I think it is better to take their question as a 2-part question about all of it, with particular focus on Jesus' second coming at the end of the age. And the 2 parts of the question are, when will be your coming and the end of the age, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And it looks like Jesus answers the question as a 2-part question, but in reverse. So Jesus answers the question about the sign first in verses 4 through 28. And then in verse 29, he answers the when question, immediately after the tribulation of those days. And he goes on to say more. And this reverse ordering of the answer makes sense, because if they want to know when he will come and what will be the sign that he's about to come, then the sign must come before he comes. So it makes sense that Jesus answers the question about the sign before he answers the question about the when. This means that everything before verse 29 is the sign, right? From verses 4 through 28. This is how we're going to approach this passage, as verse 4 through 28 as being the sign that the disciples asked about. And we can see that we're on the right track when we're doing that, because Jesus says in verses 32 and 33, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he or it is near at the very gates." So in verse 33, he says, when you see all these things, you know that he or it is near. He, or if it is his second coming and the end of the age, right? So in verse 33, all these things must be everything before Jesus' second coming, which is verses 4 through 28. And so when you see everything foretold in verses 4 through 28 happening, you must know that the coming of Jesus and the end of the age is near. So verses 4 through 28 is the sign that he is coming, and it's the sign of the end of the age. But Jesus answers more specifically the question of when in verse 36, right? We looked at verse 29. He says immediately after the tribulation. But he also answers it more specifically in verse 36. He says, "But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." And that's the definitive answer to the when question. No one knows. So that really settles the when question. No one knows. But the problem is, what are the signs that Jesus speaks about in verses 4 through 28? If we were saying verses 4 through 28 are the signs, or is the sign that Jesus is about to come, and that the end of the age is near, what are those signs that Jesus speaks about? Have they already happened? Or will they all still happen in the future? And this is where the difficulties lie in this passage. There are four main interpretations. Right? The first interpretation says that all of the signs from verses 4 through 28 was in the past. At year AD 70, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans under Nero, and the Jews were dispersed from Judea. And so some people say all of verses 4 through 28 were fulfilled then. Second interpretation says it'll all be in the future. At some point in the future, all these things will be fulfilled in the last few years, right before Jesus' second coming. The third interpretation says it is partly about the past and partly about the future. And there are kind of two schools within this camp, right? Some in this camp argue that there is a double fulfillment, with the events of AD 70 being repeated right at the end before Jesus returns. And others will say that at some point in the speech of Jesus, he switches from speaking about the past to speaking about the future. And then the fourth interpretation is that all the events describe the whole period from Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension until his return. This morning, I'm going to argue that the last option is the correct option. Okay, so I'm going to argue that verses 4 through 28 describe the whole period between Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension until his return. And I will make the case in 4 steps, okay? Again, this is a very difficult passage, and so it's going to be a bit dense. I feel like I have to argue the case for a particular interpretation, and so you might have trouble following a little bit, but bear with me, and keep your Bible open and try to see what I'm trying to show you, okay? But I'm going to try to make the case in 4 steps. The first step, we're going to look at the Daniel background of this speech. If you look at Matthew 24, verse 15, Jesus says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand." Jesus explicitly says that he's talking about a prophecy of Daniel. And this is the only time Daniel is mentioned by name in the whole New Testament. And when he says, let the reader understand, he's saying those who read Daniel must understand Daniel and relate what Jesus is saying to Daniel's prophecy. So that is what we will try to do first. We will look at Daniel and try to understand what that is about. Second step, I will argue that in chapter 24, verse 30, where it says, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, I'm going to argue that that is about Jesus' second coming at the general resurrection. Third, I will argue that everything in verses 4 through 28 should be seen as one set of events, which Jesus calls a great tribulation. And this is against those who think that Jesus switches from speaking about AD 70 to speaking about the future at some point. I'm going to argue that this is all one set in the way that Jesus tells it. And then lastly, I will argue that the events of verses 4 through 28 as one set of events begin with Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. I've already kind of said in step 2, we will already argue that when Jesus says, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, that is his second coming. So that is the end bracket of it, and then the beginning bracket is that it begins with Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. Okay. Some caveats before we begin with this. This is not the definitive interpretation of the passage. It's my interpretation. I argued for this in half of a chapter of my dissertation. It may not answer all the difficult parts of the passage. Okay, so we must be careful and charitable to those who have differing interpretations. I think there may be some of you here who come from different Christian backgrounds that have different interpretations of this, right? Particularly, I think there's a prevalence of seeing a lot of what's in 24 to be about the future, exclusively about the future. If you're coming from dispensational backgrounds especially, right? So there are a lot of good evangelical Christians who hold that view. We should be charitable to them. But I do think that the view that I'm going to argue for here is consistent with the teaching of the Bible elsewhere about the last days. And I also think that it is consistent with what I believe is the mainstream Reformed view of eschatology. All right, so first step, let's look at the Daniel background. Okay, Jesus says in verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. An expression similar to abomination of desolation occurs 3 times in Daniel. Before we start looking at that, another caveat. The portions of Daniel that Jesus is referring to is also notoriously difficult and controversial. Our English translations have done the best they can, but the meaning of those portions of Daniel is not clear. But Jesus says we must understand them to understand him. So we will try our best to understand Daniel. The 3 times something like abomination of desolation occurs is in Daniel 9:27. It says, "And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator." The ancient Greek translations of Daniel translate the expression, "On the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate." That expression, the ancient Greek translations translated as, "On the temple, an abomination of desolations." That's all it says, which is very close to the expression we have in Matthew 24:15. Second time the expression occurs is in 11:31, Daniel 11:31, which says, "And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate." And that expression, the abomination that makes desolate, again, one of the ancient Greek translations of Daniel translates it as, "They will put an abomination of desolation." And then the third time, it's in Daniel 12:11. "And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days." And again, the expression, "the abomination that makes desolate," in the ESV, is translated by the ancient Greek translations as abomination of desolations. Okay, so those are the 3 places where we see this expression of Daniel, which Jesus explicitly says he's referring to. For our purposes, we will look at Daniel 11 and 12. Okay? Daniel 10 through 12 is actually one long vision. It's the last vision of the book of Daniel. And in Daniel 10, an angel comes to Daniel and says that he will explain to Daniel what will happen in the future. And so in chapter 11, the angel begins to tell Daniel what will happen after the Persian Empire, right? Because Daniel went into exile under the Babylonian Empire, and then the Persians took over, and Daniel survived until the Persians had taken over. And so the angel begins to tell Daniel what will happen after the Persian Empire. And the angel foretells the coming of Alexander the Great and how his empire will be broken up into 4 kingdoms. And he tells Daniel about several generations of the kings of 2 of those 4 kingdoms that had split up after Alexander the Great. And the 2 that the angel spends most his time telling Daniel about are the ones that are just north and just south of Israel. And the angel tells him how these 2 kingdoms that are just north and south of Israel would wage war against each other, and Israel would be caught in the crossfire, basically. And then in verse 21 of chapter 11, the angel begins to tell Daniel about one of those kings who would persecute the Jews. And the prophecy in this section very closely lines up with what we know about the Seleucid king named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus IV Epiphanes was the Seleucid king in the first half of the 2nd century BC. And he came to Jerusalem and desecrated the temple. He put a statue of Zeus in it and sacrificed pigs on the altar. And so the Jews revolted against him and waged war. And Antiochus ended up killing a lot of Jews. But the Jews ultimately won out and gained independence for a time. The Jews celebrate Hanukkah as the rededication of the temple after the defeat of Antiochus IV. That's where Hanukkah comes from. And we know all of this about the history of what happened in that war from a couple of books we call Apocrypha. Apocrypha are books that we do not consider to be inspired scripture, but are related to things that are recorded in the Bible. And one of these books, First Maccabees, which was probably written about 50 years after the war against Antiochus IV, narrates the events using a lot of the language that we see in Daniel 11, 21 through 35. It looks like the author of First Maccabees knew Daniel 11 and was writing to say that the prophecy of Daniel in those verses was fulfilled at the time of Antiochus IV. And this author of First Maccabees, describing the desecration of the temple under Antiochus IV, uses the expression, the abomination of desolation. Okay, so that is how that expression was used in late 2nd century BC, relating it to the events of Antiochus IV, and especially the desecration of the temple that occurred at that time. And so that's Daniel 11, 21 through 35. That prophecy is about Antiochus IV, how he will persecute the Jews and desecrate the temple. At about 1136, the vision of Daniel seems to move on to the next tyrant who will pick up where Antiochus IV left off. And 1140 says that this tyrant will be making war at the time of the end. And the description of this tyrant is very similar to the description of Antiochus IV in the previous section. So much so that many scholars actually argue that even that section is still about Antiochus IV. But I think there are plenty of reasons to think that it's not about Antiochus IV anymore. It's about someone else after Antiochus. In the last verses, chapter 11, it tells how the tyrant will die. And then we come to Daniel 12, right? And we'll read Daniel 12, verses 1 through 3. It says, "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people." At that time points back to the time of the tyrant at the time of the end. At that time, at the time of the end. And he says, "And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time." Time of trouble, the Greek translations translate as time of tribulation. There will be a time of tribulation as has never been since there was a nation. So the time of the tyrant at the time of the end will be a time of tribulation unlike any other, is what Daniel 12:1 says. And it says, at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. The expression "shall be delivered," I think, is better translated as "shall escape." There will be a way of escaping and fleeing this tribulation. And then verses 2 and 3. If you've been coming to evening services or if you've been at these Sunday schools consistently, we've read these verses several times as I was preaching through the parables and even in this Sunday school. Daniel chapter 12, verses 2 and 3 says, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." I've mentioned these verses several times. It is about the general resurrection at the end of time. Okay? So, that's a lot of Daniel. But let me just summarize real quick. Daniel 11:21 through 35 is a prophecy about Antiochus IV, who will persecute the Jews and desecrate the temple, and the desecration is called the abomination of desolations. The abomination of desolation. Daniel 11:36 through 45 is a prophecy about another tyrant, a subsequent tyrant, at the time of the end, who will be like Antiochus IV in many ways. Daniel 12:1 says that time at the end will be a time of unprecedented tribulation from which God's people will escape. And then Daniel 12:2-3 says that there will be a general resurrection for judgment. Okay, so let's keep that sequence in mind. There's Antiochus IV, a tyrant, and that tyrant is the time of the end. There's tribulation, and then there's general resurrection. Right? Okay. Keep that in your head as we will come back to it. Okay? So that's the first step. That's the Daniel background of the expression when Jesus says the prophecy of Daniel about the abomination of desolation. Second step, the Son of Man coming on the clouds in verse 30, 24:30. Okay, I'm going to argue that this expression is about Jesus' second coming at the general resurrection at the end of the age for judgment. Okay, so let's read Matthew 24, verses 29 through 31. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Again, I've argued this before, but I don't expect all of you to remember everything I say ever, so we're going to rehearse a little bit of this. But I'm going to argue that the Son of Man coming in glory with angels, gathering and separating, is language used to speak about Jesus' second coming at the general resurrection for judgment at the end of the age. We see this in Matthew 13, verses 40 and 41. This was the parable of the weeds. Jesus says, just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers. Right? So you see all of that. Son of Man, angels, gathering, right? All of that has to do with the end of the age. Again, Matthew 13, verses 47 through 49. Again, the kingdom of heaven, this is the parable of the dragnet, at the end of the parable of the dragnet. Again, the kingdom of, the whole parable actually. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind. When it was full, men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous. So gathering, separating, done by the angels, is something that happens at the end of the age, at the resurrection for judgment. Again, Matthew 25, verses 31 and 32. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Right? And that is clearly about the last judgment at Jesus' second coming. So when in Matthew 24, verse 30, Jesus says, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. He's talking about the second coming at the general resurrection for judgment. Right? So 24:30, when he says, Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, second coming, general resurrection. Okay. So that's the second step of my argument. Third step. When is the second coming? Right? Verse 29 says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So immediately after the tribulation of those days is when Jesus will come again. Okay? So what is the tribulation of those days? All the way from verse 4, Jesus has been talking about a bad time. Is he talking about everything he has been saying since verse 4, or only parts of it? In verse 21 as well, Jesus says, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. Is this great tribulation in verse 21 the same as the tribulation in verse 29, which will immediately precede the second coming? Or are these two different tribulations? Because that is how certain interpretations take it when they say some of this is about the past, some of this is in the future. They say verse 21, or they will say some parts which refer to tribulation is not the same tribulation as the tribulation in 29. So the question is, when Jesus says verse 21, great tribulation, and then in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation, is he talking about the same thing? I'm going to say yes. Now, how do we know? This is where we go back to Daniel, okay? Remember Daniel 12. Daniel 12:1 said, there will be a tribulation at the time of the end, and then there will be a general resurrection, right? In Matthew 24, 29, 30, it says that immediately after the tribulation of those days, the Son of Man will come for the general resurrection. So the tribulation in Matthew 24, 29 is the tribulation of Daniel 12:1, right? Because Daniel 12:1 is the tribulation right before resurrection. And in 24:29, he says immediately after the tribulation, right? What about the tribulation in verse 21? Matthew 24, verse 21 says, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. This is almost identical in language to the tribulation in Daniel 12:1. Daniel 12:1 says, and there shall be a time of tribulation such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. So the great tribulation in Matthew 24:21 is also the tribulation of Daniel 12:1. And so because Matthew 24:29 is the tribulation of Daniel 12:1, and Matthew 24:21 is also Daniel 12:1, then 24:21 and 24:29 must be the same tribulation. Am I making sense? Is everybody following? This is very dense, I understand. Thank you. Okay. And some scholars who argue that some of the tribulation was in the past and others will be in the future, they argue that there is a change in verse 15. Right? At the end of verse 14, Jesus says, and then the end will come. And then verse 15 says, so when you see, so they say verses 4 through 14 is one thing, and then at 14, the end. And then 15 through 28 is another thing. And so they will say 4 through 14 was in the past, 15 through 28 will be in the future. But I don't think that is right. Okay. Both sections, 4 through 14 and 15 through 28, describe the same things, basically. In both sections, there are false Christs and false prophets who deceive many. Verse 9, which is in the first section, also talks about tribulation. It says, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake." So even at verse 9, he's talking about tribulation. And then we've seen 21 and 29 clearly about tribulation. Also, Jesus says, "When you see the abomination of desolation, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." So logically, the abomination of desolation is not the end, right? Verse 14 says, "And then the end will come. So when you see the abomination of desolations," in verse 15, "flee to the mountains." It doesn't work to say, "And then the end will come. So when you see the abomination of desolation," must mean the abomination of desolation is the end. It's not. Because if it was the end, why would Jesus tell his disciples to flee? The abomination of desolation is something someone must see and perceive that the prophecy of Daniel is being fulfilled. It is the sign that tells us that the tribulation of Daniel 12:1 is upon us. We said that the abomination of desolation was the desecration of the temple under Antiochus IV. But we also said that in Daniel 11:36 through 45, there will be another end-time tyrant who looks like, who does a lot of things the same as Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So Jesus is saying something similar, right? There was Antiochus IV who desecrated the temple, the abomination of desolation. At the time of the end, there will be another abomination of desolation. There will be another desecration of the temple. So the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is not the end, but it is the sign, right? It is the sign that the great tribulation that will be immediately followed by the second coming and the general resurrection is underway. So, abomination of desolation is the sign of this whole section of from verse 4 through 28. We call that whole section the Great Tribulation, which is what Jesus calls it, and the abomination of desolation, the desecration and destruction of the temple that occurred at AD 70 is a sign that we are in the end-time Great Tribulation. Is everybody tracking? Okay. Last step. When does this Great Tribulation start? We already said that Jesus' second coming will follow immediately after the Great Tribulation. This means that the tribulation will last until his second coming, but when does it start? Jesus doesn't explicitly say. But there are a couple of things in this discourse that suggest that this tribulation starts with Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. After Jesus prophesies all these things about the Great Tribulation and his second coming, he says that no one knows the hour when he will return. So everyone must always be ready. And to make this application, he tells two parables in chapter 25. The first is the parable of the 10 virgins, right? There are 10 virgins waiting for the wedding, and the 5 wise ones prepare oil in advance for the lamp, while the 5 foolish ones do not. When the groom comes, the foolish ones had run out of oil and went to buy more, and they missed the wedding. The second parable is the famous parable of talents, right? 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent. We know that story very well. Let me test how well you know that story. Without looking, do you know how this parable begins? Verse 14. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. The man is Jesus, right? The man in the parable is Jesus. And him going on a journey must be his death, resurrection, and ascension, right? If we're Christian, there's nothing else we can make of that expression. A man going on a journey, he's going away, right? And the man coming back to settle accounts must be Jesus' second coming, right? So the parable begins with Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, and ends at his return. Jesus is telling this parable to illustrate the point he has been making in chapter 24 about being faithful in the great tribulation, right? So this parable applies Matthew 24 to his hearers. And the beginning of the application is the departure of the man. So there's a strong possibility that the great tribulation in chapter 24 also begins with Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, just as the parable begins with the man going on a journey. And this is supported by what Jesus says in chapter 24, verse 34. He says, "Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." Jesus did not come back before that generation passed away, right? So did Jesus lie or make a mistake? I hope you know what I'm going to say about that. No. Why not? Well, it depends on what Jesus means by when he says all these things. When he says, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So what does he mean by all these things? Let's look at verses 32 and 33 again. This is chapter 24, verses 32 and 33. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, or it, the end of the age, is near at the very gates. So in verse 33, when he says, when you see all these things, that can't include Jesus' second coming, right? Because you're supposed to see all these things and know that he's about to come, right? So all these things includes everything except Jesus' second coming, right? That's how he uses that expression in verse 33 when he says all these things. So obviously, Jesus' return is not included. So if that is what Jesus means by all these things in verse 33, then that is what he means by all these things in verse 34, when he says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." He means that this generation, the generation that was alive at the time of Jesus, would not pass away until the great tribulation takes place. All these things in the great tribulation, without saying this generation will not pass away until I return. Does that make sense? And everything in verses 4 through 28 was, partially at least, fulfilled in the lifetime of those who heard those words of Jesus. False prophets were a problem for the first generation of Christians, according to Matthew 7:15 even. And persecution and tribulation are things the first disciples were to prepare themselves for and endure, according to several places in Matthew. Matthew 5, 10, 12, 44, 7, 14, 10, 23, 13, 22, 21. And we see these things beginning immediately after Jesus' ascension in Acts, right? And so tribulation, persecution, false prophets, false Christs, all of that has been happening since Jesus' ascension. And the abomination of desolation, the destruction of the temple, occurred in AD 70, right? So all of those did happen within the generation of Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension. But they are also continuing to this day, because the tribulation will last until Jesus comes back. False prophets, persecution, tribulation will continue until Jesus returns, because the great tribulation will last until he comes. Okay. Summary and conclusions. That was dense, I understand. I hope you were able to follow some of it. 4 through 21 is one period of tribulation, which Jesus calls the Great Tribulation. And this Great Tribulation is the tribulation of Daniel 12:1, which is right before the general resurrection of Daniel 12:2. And during this Great Tribulation, there will be false prophets and false Christs, and there will be persecution, and the temple in Jerusalem would be destroyed. This Great Tribulation began with Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, and will continue until he returns. When Jesus will return, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. But it means that we are living in that Great Tribulation of the time of the end, of Matthew 24 and of Daniel 12. We are living in the time of the end. The world has been in the time of the end ever since the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. That is why the New Testament authors say, in these last days, and it is the last hour. We are living in that final time before Christ's return at the end of the age, when the dead will be raised and judged. This means we shouldn't be looking for signs of when the end-time tribulation might begin, right? Again, people who think it's all in the future try to look for signs and say, oh, now the tribulation is beginning, or the tribulation hasn't begun because this and this and this hasn't happened. No, it's all happening now. We've been in it since the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so we must be faithful in it, in the time of tribulation, and always ready for Christ to return. And that is the point of the parables, and you might even say that is the point of the whole discourse. Right? And Jesus says in verse 13, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Okay, so that is the eschatological discourse. We're over time. I'm sure many of you have a lot of questions, but let me pray and close, and then maybe we can talk some more afterwards. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for Jesus' teachings on the time of the end. We thank you for the reminder that we are living in the time of the end, in the time of the great tribulation, that your people will be persecuted. And we thank you for the reminder that we are to be faithful in it, waiting for your return, even as we do not know the day or hour. Help us to be faithful as you have taught us to be. For we ask in Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.